By the year 8 BCE, Augustus had grown into a living monument, revered across the empire, respected by friend and foe alike, but behind the polished marble of his public image, the man who built an empire was now a man increasingly surrounded by ghosts. His closest allies were gone. His greatest generals, dead. His friends, one by one, had faded into the past. And now, standing in the twilight of his life, Augustus faced a bitter truth that no crown could shield him from: he had no one left to carry the world he'd built. The death of his son Drusus had hit him harder than anyone realized. In Drusus, Augustus had seen promise, strength, perhaps even a reflection of the Republic's old virtues. And yet now, all that remained were three unlikely heirs: Tiberius, his stepson, dutiful but cold, competent but joyless, and Gaius and Lucius Caesar, his grandsons by blood, but young, untested, raised in privilege and ceremony, not in hardship or war. It was not the imperial future he had imagined. And so Augustus did what he had always done best: he adapted. Tiberius was dispatched to the Rhine, not just as a soldier, but as a symbol, the last trustworthy blade Augustus could count on to keep the frontier calm. And in the heart of Rome, Augustus played the role of the statesman yet again, putting on his reluctant act before the Senate, performing the rituals of power with a tired grace that masked the growing hollowness beneath. It was an empire still shining on the outside, but behind the marble columns and golden standards, the machinery was starting to grind. The old generation was gone. The next wasn't ready. And Augustus, now more alone than ever, began to see the cracks forming in the very foundation he had spent a lifetime building. He could manage the Senate. He could stabilize provinces. But he could not force legacy. And no matter how many titles he accepted, how many victories he staged, the question lingered: who would Rome belong to when he was gone? While Augustus wrestled with the ghosts of lost heirs and reluctant successors, the empire's borders reminded him that Rome's glory was never just about statues and speeches, it was about control, and that control was slipping. In the east, the once stable province of Judea was unraveling fast. Herod the Great, Rome's most reliable client king, had died, and what followed was not succession, it was chaos. His son Archelaus inherited the throne and the fury of a people who saw their cities pillaged and their wealth siphoned to fund Roman ambition. When riots broke out during Passover, Archelaus tried restraint, but restraint was mistaken for weakness. A mob stoned Roman auxiliaries, forcing Archelaus to retreat, only to return with brutal force. Blood soaked the streets of Jerusalem, but violence did not bring peace. It brought escalation. The Roman governor Varus arrived with legions. His orders were clear: restore order at any cost. And he did. Cities were burned. Rebels crucified by the thousands. Judea was pacified in the Roman sense of the word, meaning, subdued in fear, not healed in trust. And yet, while one fire was being smothered, another was quietly lighting along the Parthian border. Armenia, the always tense buffer state between empires, had fallen into crisis again. A pro-Roman king had died. A Parthian-backed replacement now sat on the throne. Augustus could no longer ignore the pressure. But with Tiberius still sulking in Rhodes and Agrippa long dead, the emperor faced a terrible choice: send the untested Gaius Caesar. And so he did. Not because Gaius was ready, but because there was no one else. The young prince left Rome with banners, honorific titles, and the hopes of an empire on his shoulders. But a crown doesn't make a commander. And what waited for him in Armenia was not ceremony, it was betrayal, siege warfare, and the raw uncertainty of a region that had already devoured better men. Augustus had tried to shape the future through heirs and offices. But the frontier didn't care about titles. It cared about strength. And that was something no decree could guarantee. If Augustus had one gift, it was his ability to project control, even when everything around him was quietly unraveling. He had survived civil wars, outlived rivals, and built the bones of an empire that would last for centuries. But no amount of power could save him from the one thing that every emperor eventually fears, the failure of succession. The deaths of Lucius and Gaius Caesar weren't just personal losses, they were devastating fractures in the careful future Augustus had tried to shape. Lucius, full of promise, never even reached his first post before falling sick and dying in Massilia. And Gaius, once celebrated with titles and fanfare, returned from Armenia not in triumph, but in pain, wounded, infected, and broken in body and spirit. He died shortly after, on a quiet day far from home, the empire no closer to a future than it had been decades before. Rome mourned. The mausoleum of Augustus filled with the ashes of boys who had been raised to rule but never got the chance to lead. Their spears and shields were put on display, symbols of what could have been, not what was. And yet, for all his sorrow, Augustus didn't have time to grieve. The machine of empire could not pause for loss. There were borders to guard, legates to appoint, and a senate that needed reassurance more than reflection. So once again, Augustus turned to the man he had pushed away, Tiberius. He recalled him from Rhodes, not just as a general, but as a last resort. But this time, there was a condition. If Tiberius was to be heir, he had to adopt Germanicus, Augustus' great-nephew, in hopes of preserving both bloodline and legacy. Tiberius agreed. And just like that, Rome's future was rearranged once again, not with idealism, but with necessity. In the end, Augustus didn't get the dynasty he dreamed of. He got the dynasty that remained. And as he prepared to pass the empire to his reluctant stepson, the world beyond the marble pillars was already stirring again, especially in the north, where the forests of Germania were beginning to whisper with unrest. Tiberius didn't return to Rome with ambition in his heart, he returned with duty carved into his bones. He had watched from afar as the empire strained to hold together its succession plans, and now, with the heirs gone and Augustus aging, the burden of legacy fell squarely on his shoulders. There was no more room for distance, no more space for retreat. The north was stirring again. In Germania, once thought pacified by years of Roman roads and Roman markets, revolt was in the air. Old allies were turning restless. Old promises had begun to crumble. And so Tiberius moved, not with ceremony, but with precision. He crossed the Rhine, not as a conqueror chasing glory, but as a soldier with memories of past failures and a map of unfinished work. Along the Weser and deep into the lands of the Cherusci, he advanced with an army of hardened veterans, many of whom had served with him before. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. One tribe after another submitted. Fortresses were built. Roads repaired. Winter came, and still, Tiberius pressed on, deeper than any Roman had dared in years. His campaign didn't light up the marble halls of Rome with triumphal arches, but it worked. It stabilized. And Augustus, watching from afar, saw in Tiberius not just a general, but a safeguard. This was the man who had once walked away from power. Now he was holding the empire's northern edge with steady, deliberate strength. But peace was never permanent, especially in a world held together by force. Even as Tiberius secured the frontier, cracks elsewhere began to widen. In Illyricum and Dalmatia, resentment brewed beneath the surface. Taxes, conscription, broken promises, they all festered into something dangerous. And Augustus, for all his experience, knew that another storm was coming. A storm that would test everything he had built. But that, as history always reminds us, is a story for another time. By the dawn of 5 CE, Augustus could feel it in his bones, the weight of years, of battles fought and heirs buried, of dreams revised again and again until all that remained was duty. The empire he had crafted, held together by force and faith and sheer political will, was still standing. But barely. And while the map still showed the borders of Rome stretching from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, Augustus knew better than anyone that lines on parchment were fragile things. Germania was quiet for now, thanks to Tiberius, but it wasn't peace, it was pressure, held down with discipline, not trust. The frontiers were cracking in the Balkans. Illyricum and Dalmatia, places Rome had once pacified with legions and roads, were now seething with unrest. Tax burdens, forced recruitment, broken promises, it was no longer just resistance, it was resentment, ready to ignite. And Augustus, too old to ride with the legions, too wise to believe Rome was unshakable, was running out of time. He had already lost Drusus, Agrippa, Lucius, and Gaius. Now all that stood between Rome and chaos was Tiberius, a man who had never wanted power, and Germanicus, a young flame not yet tested by the cold wind of command. But Augustus didn't flinch. He never had. Instead, he made one final move, a political masterstroke cloaked in necessity. He formally adopted Tiberius as his son and heir, and in the same breath, ordered Tiberius to adopt Germanicus. It was an inheritance of burdens, not crowns. And with that, Augustus prepared to pass on the world he had rebuilt from ashes. Not a perfect world. Not the world he had dreamed of. But one that had survived. Barely. The Illyrian revolt, the greatest challenge Rome would face since Hannibal, was just over the horizon. And as the legions braced themselves for what would come, Augustus remained in Rome, watching as the sun set on an era he had shaped with blood and brilliance. His legacy wasn't just in statues or laws or the marble walls of the Forum, it was in the fragility of power, in the hope that Rome could endure its own uncertainty, and in the quiet, unshakable belief that, despite everything, the center would hold. For now.